Hello, hello, hello. I'm particularly delighted today to be joined by Yousef Munayyer, who is the head of the Palestine-Israel program at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., a brilliant US Palestinian writer. I've been following his work throughout the horror of the last 2.5 months now. Yousef, firstly, it's a big honor for you to join us. This is horrific for anyone who cares about war crimes, human rights, that kind of thing. But for those who have Palestinian heritage, this is a period of huge trauma. So I always appreciate people like yourself coming to speak about this. I just want to start with some comments made by the UN aid chief, Martin Griffiths, in the Financial Times. He says there's terrible suffering in other places, but at least those affected can flee. He says the human catastrophe is entering a new phase. It's disease, hunger that's beginning to be the lead cause of death and deprivation. The death toll from disease could be multiples of that from fighting and airstrikes. That is generally what happens in war. We're only looking often at violent deaths at the moment, which have been recorded. And he points out that those violent deaths from airstrikes and bullets as well, of course, are dramatically undercounted because he said we've yet to see what's under the rubble. These estimates of around 18,000 dead. Once you start digging under the rubble, the statistics change radically. In the case of February's Turkish earthquake, the number of those dead doubled. I just want your thoughts on that, given what I would regard as quite extensive atrocity denial, in which death figures have actually been doubted extensively, but they're actually likely to be a very substantial underestimate.
Yeah, and thank you, Owen, very much for having me and for shining a light on this issue. The point that was made there in the Financial Times article is absolutely right. I mean, the level of destruction that we are seeing in Gaza is unprecedented in so many ways. Records are being set for the pace at which children are being killed, aid workers are being killed, journalists are being killed. I mean, international organizations everywhere are saying that we've never seen anything like this. And yet we've barely started to see the scale of destruction that's really taken place on the ground. We don't know how many people are under the rubble, but we can expect that there are very significant numbers of people who are still trapped there. The situation is dire on the ground. People cannot reach those who are trapped if they're even able to get to the homes that were targeted. There are also areas that's important to remember that are closed off and under the control of the Israeli military. And there are, many people who may have been killed or injured or left to die, not under the rubble, but out in the street in areas where people simply can't get to because they're closed off zones. And so one day, and I hope that day comes as soon as possible when this ends, we're going to realize that the horrors that were inflicted on the people of Gaza are even more severe than the record-setting horrors that we think have taken place already.
I mean, many people have made this point, but this Israel was a state which was, for example, an enemy of the West, then the calls for military intervention would have been deafening actually quite a long time ago.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, one of the things that we've been seeing from Western states, of course, is the support of this. And I think a large part of that is because, Israel effectively lost the war on October 7th, the day that this most recent round started. And October 7th reflected a major failure of policy, Israeli policy, and policy that was supported by Western governments. And this, of course, was a very difficult reality to sort of accept. And what we've been seeing since then is an effort by both the Israeli government and their Western backers to try to save face after this massive failure on October 7th. And of course, we knew from the outset that this was going to be horrifically bloody. And of course, we knew that it was not going to bring us anywhere closer to peace. And yet, we saw nothing but full backing from Western governments from this for over 2 months now. And now you're starting to hear the refrain from some of these Western capitals that, okay, we need a ceasefire. Okay, Israel has gone too far. But the reality is we knew that this is where things were going to go 2 months ago. This was entirely predictable that we were going to be here. And now you're starting to hear narratives from Western capitals about how the way that Israel has conducted this operation is counterproductive because it's only going to increase support, for example, for Hamas and not really be able to eliminate the group as an idea, right? And again, all of this was entirely predictable from the outset. So why? We have to ask the question, why did so many people have to die for Western governments to finally come to this conclusion that Palestinians were not going to be bombed into liking Israelis? I could have told you that long ago, and thousands of people could still be with us.
I mean, just on that, I wrote a column back in October, which was about this phenomenon we saw after the Iraq war, where people said, who backed the war, who said, if I knew then what I know now. So there was this formula used by those who tried to, you know, well, if I had the information available now, they wouldn't have backed that. And that I felt that this would be revived in the case of Gaza, as if it wasn't predictable. I'm just interested, given at the moment we've got Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister here in Britain, now saying too many civilians have died in Gaza. You have the former Defense Secretary here, Conservative as well, who says that that Israel is conducting a killing rage, essentially accusing Israel of war crimes, I would say, and saying that he will fuel the conflict for another 50 years. That this is radicalizing, he says, Muslim youth across the world. What do you think of that when you get, or Biden, when he said it was indiscriminate bombing? What do you think of that in the context of the fact that Western governments, particularly the US, have facilitated this from the get-go?
Well, let's take both of these things separately for a moment. The comments from Sunak and the comments from Biden, because I think they each speak to something important. You know, in terms of Sunak saying too many civilians have died, what's the number? What's the threshold beyond which we got to a point where we finally discovered a conscience here in the West? I've been asking that question from the very beginning. How many Palestinian civilians have to die before you figure out that this is not helpful, and it has to come to an immediate end? Apparently, that number for the UK is somewhere around 18 or 20,000, whatever the number is today. It's hard to tell because it keeps going up. But it wasn't at 15,000. It wasn't at 10,000. For whatever reason, they decided that this is the value of human life to the United Kingdom when it comes to Palestinians. And for the United States, of course, that number seems to be higher because we're not there yet. And at the same time, and here we'll talk about Biden's comments, he's acknowledged last week, and it wasn't the first time, by the way, he acknowledged again in November that the Israelis had been engaged in indiscriminate bombing. This is an acknowledgement, not just that the Israelis are committing war crimes, but also that the president of the United States is failing to enforce American law as it relates to the transfer of weapons to another military, which, of course, the United States is not just engaged in, but engaged in to a massive degree, and is looking for ways to expedite this process without the oversight of Congress. And so it just speaks to a colossal moral failure on the part of these leaders who, in the same breath, tell us that they care about human rights, that they care about a rules-based order, and dare speak about leading the free world.
I mean, I'm interested in that very crucial point you just made there, because, at the moment, there's a sitting British member of parliament, belongs to the Liberal Democrats, live tweeting a massacre at the church in Gaza, in which, for example, the scenes are apocalyptic there, and 2 Christian Palestinians were shot dead by the IDF, who deny it, but no one believes a word they say. That we had reports of at a besieged hospital, tents with wounded patients being bulldozed by the Israeli army, with starving cats feasting on the bodies of those killed, where we have, just the constant bombing of wiping out entire families off the face of the earth, whether they be the families of journalists, UN aid workers, or ordinary citizens. I'm just interested in terms of a lot of the world did not take Western moral authority very seriously already, and they thought it was based on hypocrisy. But I don't see how the West now, I mean, if you look at Syria at the moment and Assad committing war crimes in a school, how could the West with a straight face condemn that now? And I'm just interested in what you think that legacy will be in terms of the claims to moral authority which Western power uses in order to basically, I guess, assert its own right to global hegemony, basically.
Yeah, I think we saw the United States take a major sort of blow to its credibility after it launched the war against Iraq some 20 years ago. At least with Afghanistan, there were many people who could rationalize that war as an effort to go after the perpetrators of 9/11 in some way. But Iraq was, nobody understood how this made sense, even among Western allies. And I don't think the United States has ever really recovered from that in terms of its global credibility, and only done greater damage to itself. And I think of this moment as one that is far, far more significant, which is, quite something when you consider how big of a deal the Iraq war was and for how long it lasted. But I think in these last couple of months, both because of the scale of the atrocities that are taking place, because of the extent to which the United States has been willing to back them, despite all the facts we see on the ground to the contrary about what this really is about, and the fact that it's happening in Palestine. And this piece, I think, is important. Much of the world looks at Palestine differently than other spots of the world, and the reason is complicated and multifaceted. For one thing, this is the longest lasting occupation in the world. It is one of the last spots to achieve liberation from colonization, and especially throughout the third world and among communities that care about justice and human rights. Palestine is a magnifying lens. Everything that happens there has a tremendous impact. And it's also a spot where the West, of course, meets the East, and this narrative of human rights and democracy becomes so clearly exposed. And so, I think that even though, the Iraq war, and we should not minimize the horrors of that aggression, this moment is probably even more significant in terms of damage to American credibility around the world.
I'm just interested in your thoughts in terms of the media coverage. I've worked now in the British media industry for 12 years. I'm a white guy from Northern England. I feel like I'm going mad over the level of dehumanization, the sense that isn't subtle, that Palestinian life has no meaningful value at all. That correctly, the killing of an Israeli civilian is rightly seen as intolerable. But there is, as you suggested earlier on, there was no limit to the number of Palestinian civilians. Well, now they say, maybe they've gone too far. We're talking about over 10,000 kids dead already, as it is killed. Sorry, I should stop saying die. And perhaps, according to the independent Euromed Human Rights Monitor, around 25,000 civilians. And these are violent deaths, as I said before. We know that the overall death toll from the collapse, basically, of society, healthcare system, hunger, just people with underlying health conditions. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I mean, this is a very large number, a proportion of Gazan society is going to die. What do you think about that, just the media coverage and just how Palestinian life has been treated throughout this from the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's a reflection of long-standing sort of Islamophobia and racism towards people of the region. That part of it is not particularly new. And in this moment, it's on steroids. It's also, I think, a response to the positions of elected officials And the media is following the lead of elected officials whose statements characterize Palestinian life in this very dehumanizing way. I mean, you look at, for example, here in the United States, the language of the Biden administration, particularly at the outset of this a couple months ago, was tremendously dehumanizing to Palestinians. And we've had several Palestinian-Americans here in the United States targeted and killed with direct violence because Americans who are hearing and digesting this information from their officials in the media identify Palestinians as Palestinians to be worthy targets of deadly violence. So, the media is responding a lot to officials here. And when you heard the president of the United States, say that, the death toll that's being reported in Gaza is inaccurate and that he can't trust the Palestinians to relay the truth. I mean, this is a kind of language that we have not even seen from previous American administrations when it comes to the dehumanization of Palestinians. It's really reached a new low. And I think, there's always been tremendous shortcomings in terms of media coverage of this issue. But in this moment, I think a lot of it is due to the shaping of coverage really around the dehumanizing positions of government officials that are leading a lot of the news on this.
Asking to talk about hope might seem like at best eccentric thing to do right now. But I am wondering, I mean, we've seen these massive mobilizations in support of Palestine, the biggest mobilizations ever on a global scale in support of the Palestinians. If you look at the polling, there has been a shift towards a ceasefire. In Britain, it's overwhelming, but in America as well. Now that shift has certainly happened. But also younger generations, the polling shows, are more sympathetic towards the Palestinian people than any other previous generation. Do you see that as a potential source of hope that actually, despite the absolute horror, this has been, in the worst possible way, quite an educational experience for lots of people? If I look at the comments under my videos, a lot of people who frankly were not that engaged in Palestine before, suddenly this has become something which has had quite a searing impact on them, I would say. What do you see in terms of the future? Could that be something which provides some hope in the way, if we look at apartheid South Africa, international, shift in attitudes and that becoming something people in the West were forced to care about, that made an impact?
Absolutely. I mean, and in South Africa, people point to Sharpeville and the Sharpeville massacre as sort of that major mobilizing moment. And in Palestine, we've had so many Sharpevilles, and one wonders how many it really is going to take to finally get to that tipping point. But I do think you're right that we are seeing mobilizations now that are unprecedented. And we saw, similar things after 2014, for example, when the Israelis also carried out a massive war in Gaza for, 2 months at the time. One of the outcomes of that was a tremendous global mobilization that led to an uptick in all kinds of efforts, including boycott, divestment, and sanction efforts within global civil society to try to hold Israel to account for its human rights and international law violations. And I think, one of the things that we're seeing now is similarly massive global mobilization in response to this. And we will continue to see after this war the carryover effect of that in organizing and activism that will not forget about this moment. The question, that I keep returning to is this enough? And how much of this will it take to actually lead to change in policy? And there's no doubt that there is change in public opinion, particularly among the younger generation. But there is also a tremendous repressive effort now to try to silence and intimidate people who are speaking up for Palestine, whether it's in the policing of protests, whether it's in the intimidation of people in the workplace or at universities. And this repression is escalating precisely because the mobilization for Palestinian rights is also escalating. And at some point, we get to that critical mass. We get to that tipping point. I just hope that it doesn't take too many more Palestinian Sharpeville's for people to get there.
Absolutely. Yousef, it was such an honor to be able to speak to you in these horrendous times, but voices of people like yourself right now more needed than ever. And it was great to have that clarity and that wisdom. So please like and subscribe and do share this video to get Yousef's message out. But Yousef, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Owen.